minutes away.
Yeah, well, I said I want to be where you can hear me, but no one can see me. Behind the cap?
Yeah.
I'm just gonna. I get paid $30 if I do this. I was gonna point at the guy who heard me sigh. Yeah, Alan. No. Local coaches are like.
It is actually mine.
No, other than
Where's Travis?
you're here.
Nice to meet you. Game Boy. Nice to meet you. You ready? Let's see.
We're on airplane. Okay.
Very
good.
Nice to meet you.
They said turn on all of our ringers.
Right. As glad as you can. So welcome to whoever's watching this online. Thank you guys for taking a little time out of a busy first day after Memorial Day, first day of the week on Tuesday, to be with us. What I'm going to do for the media here and for those of you at the table who may not know others, I'm going to give a quick intro. We're here to talk about innovation, which is a foreign concept in government as much as it ever has been in our country, and so I thought it was important that as we step forward to talk in specific terms, also in broad strokes about the ideas and the context of where the conversation should be in government, that we bring people around the table who in their own disciplines and in their own industries have actually innovated. So with that said, to my right is the CEO of Ambition, which is the office that we're in today, Travis Truitt, great friend of mine. Has started a couple companies in Chattanooga. Ambition's strength is in the in sales competition, where they've innovated greatly. To his right is Nick Mako, who's business partners across the table, Adam Baselogger. They're the co-founders of South Tree in Chattanooga. They digitize home videos, and they do it as well as anybody in the world. Beside him is Tiffany Robinson. Is this going to be Paul Cummings' seat?
You had a computer on.
Oh yeah, you're good. That's your seat. So beside Nick is Paul Cummings, who has done a lot of things that have been innovative. Most recently in Chattanooga, he's known as the CEO, co-founder, founder of Whoopl. Whoopl is a learning technology based in Chattanooga. Tiffany Robinson, CEO of Waypaver. She's recruiting millennials to Chattanooga actively. Beside her, Stephen Culp, who is the co-founder and CEO of so many things in Chattanooga, you just kind of got to pick your poison. First and foremost, still the chairman of Smart Furniture. Did some modular furniture when you're still on the West Coast that I would consider fairly innovative. Also is the co-founder of Delegator, an online marketing firm in Chattanooga, and most recently Pricewaiter, which I got to play a role in, which is basically bringing price negotiation to every single item on the internet. Jeff Averbeck, really considered around the country a trailblazer in email technology, and has worked in politics at different times in his career. Jack Studer is a partner and a co-founder of Lamppost Group, where we think we're putting a new, fresh spin on, and maybe a more fair spin on venture capital. The two co-founders of Whiteboard, Eric Brown and Taylor Jones, are here. I don't know as well as a layman person, maybe I know as well as a layman person could what you guys have done, but they've innovated and basically won just about every design award you can. They've done some things in parallax at the very beginning. Is that pretty well described? Around the table to finish off, Randy Redberg, who actually is a Chattanooga transplant, hasn't been here his whole life, is the owner, chairman of Experts Exchange, where some of the brightest people in our country actually go to this knowledge portal online to share best practices. And then to his right, Dr. Dane and Sheila Boynton, who started Chattanooga-based Thinking Media, which spun off Keytrain, which was acquired by ACT how many years ago? 3 years ago. And they're now on, they're basically taking a STEM product worldwide called Learning Book. So thanks for being here. I think your contributions to the community, to our country, speak for themselves. All of you may or may not know that really every person in the room has had some impact on me, some more than others. Some of you have known longer than others, but you've certainly impacted my willingness and desire to go and serve our country, and hopefully to take some innovation into the Congress where most people, I believe, don't even know how to use an iPhone. So everybody's got at their right in front of them sort of our breakdown of what we call the agenda of innovation. So let me start by saying this. We've picked on government a little bit for not really evolving as quickly and as efficiently as the private sector does. That's obvious and to be expected. Unfortunately, though, we're actually in a window in American history where it's even worse than that. Our government is almost paralyzed by people who are simply motivated by politics. Succeeding so often is defined by Republicans defeating Democrats or Democrats defeating Republicans, and rarely is the business of the country carried out. And even more rare do you have people in public office who identify problems and then go to work and are willing to get their hands dirty and find the right people who can fix those problems. I'm not the smartest guy in the world. I'm not a rocket scientist, but all of you here know me well enough to know that my desire to be involved in politics is driven by the needs that our country has. And I think enough pragmatism in my own blood to go and try to address these problems in a specific way. Part of what's in my blood now is our mission at Lamppost, which effectively at every bay across the hall here at Ambition, problems are being solved daily because that's what the private sector does to make money. That's, I think, at the core of every company here. Unfortunately, in Washington, that is so far from the case that I think there's now a specific need for folks like us. And I think it's important for others to know, for the media and others listening to know, the reason this group is convened is as I am sworn into the Congress in January and go forward and try to lead in new areas, this is the type of group that I'm going to lean on as I come back to Chattanooga and as we form policy. This is not just a part of the campaign, but I hope that it's a part of my service moving forward. We intro this thing by talking in a broad context about the legacy of our country, which has been to innovate and push the envelope for almost 250 years now. Not until this window, when millennials are coming of age, has government, and frankly, even the country, I think being sort of lulled into a place of complacency, considered the status quo acceptable. But that's actually where the United States of America is, and so if we're, I think, going to continue to set the standard in the world, it's going to require government reconnecting with the entrepreneurial, innovative roots of our country and fixing government problems. We start at a pretty relevant place given the national conversation with VA modernization. We all couldn't believe the news as everybody else couldn't. Part of the reason it was interesting to us is we had already begun putting together the agenda of innovation. We knew that VA modernization was going to be at the core of what we were talking about because it's so obvious. When I go to Congress in January, I'll represent 11 counties in East Tennessee. Most of them are far more rural than Hamilton County. All of them have a higher density of veterans than the average county in the country. And so you can imagine that wherever we go, certainly the voting demographic, the people I interact with the most, so many of them are veterans or have parents or relatives who are veterans who have a frustrating level of care. The quality of care at some VA hospitals is okay. Unfortunately, what we're seeing now is that the VA is having incredible difficulties modernizing to the new world. Modernizing to take care of the 2 or so million veterans who've come back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and the growing numbers of veterans, Vietnam veterans who are on the rolls. It's not all that surprising when you think about the fact that the VA originally was designed to give pensions, to provide pensions to Civil War veterans, that same exact entity is having a hard time keeping up in 2014. The main principle that we want to advocate is the idea and the ideal that veterans would have maximum flexibility. Whether it's a voucher system or similar to a Medicare reimbursement, it makes no sense. And if we're all people here who pride ourselves on some level of pragmatism and common sense in private industry, it makes absolutely no sense for a veteran in Athens, Tennessee, who needs either specialized care or surgery to have to drive through Chattanooga to Murfreesboro, Tennessee to get care at a VA hospital, particularly when Erlanger needs the business. They ought to be able to go to Erlanger. A few years ago, my father was part of piloting a program there. The VA pushed back strongly. It's time, I think, frankly, for our country and for veterans to push back on the VA a little bit, and maximum flexibility really ought to be the goal here. It's it does a great disservice to our veterans. And you hear a lot of talk, there's a lot of pomp and circumstance around what politicians do for our men and women in uniform. An example that is in the same language as a lot of people hear, you may have read this in the last few weeks, as we've found that there's actually been a faking at some VA hospitals of what has happened and what has not happened. When you check into a VA hospital, nationally, that system is run on MS-DOS. It's a system that is older than a lot of the people who work at those VA hospitals, and that's unacceptable. Second, we're going to talk about Social Security. This has been part of the third rail of American politics for a couple decades now, and it shouldn't be. It's become, 20 years ago, if you were to tell any person that in 2014 you would not only be able to access your bank account, transfer money, buy and sell stocks, do virtually anything from an iPhone that was small enough to fit in your pocket, people wouldn't have believed it, and they also wouldn't have trusted it, because just 5 or 10 years ago, they weren't even really in a position to trust it. Obviously, my generation, the millennial generation, is going to, I think, be willing to advance and innovate in this area in unprecedented ways. It's shocking that our expectation on the private level is that I can pull up my First Tennessee app and know exactly where every dime I have is. On the flip side, in Social Security, we continue to feed money into this big black cloud, hoping that one day it comes back to us. Countries around the world have actually out-innovated our country. The Chilean model is now known around the world. They actually provide their private citizens, as they pay into Social Security, with 15 different mutual funds they can buy into. And all of a sudden, regular, everyday working people in Chile, just like it could be in the United States of America, have a vested interest in what's going on in their economy. They have a vested interest in bond markets. And we ought to pursue that down the road. In the first place, we ought to bring full transparency to Social Security. And in the same way that every financial institution in the country, by market demand, has an iPhone app, you ought to have a Social Security app. And the truth is, the people around this room could make this happen in a few weeks, despite the federal government taking months and months and months and still failing to provide a web portal that even worked in providing access to health insurance. It's kind of amazing, and I think that the understanding here that I want to leave you with is that our expectations are completely different from what we get from the government and what happens in the private sector, and it ought not be, and technology is in a place where it certainly doesn't have to be. This is probably the most exciting of all of them. I think it's got the most, it probably has the most lamppost flavor of anything we're talking about. In deciding to run for Congress the second time, I did a lot of research, thought a lot about what the problems are, who the types of people that need to address them. Obviously, I made the decision that I think some young people need to be a part of the process. It's the same decision I made a couple years ago, and Shelby and I decided to double down and run again. One number stood out in the process of doing a lot of research in preparation for running for Congress again, and that is that the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, estimates that in any given year there's between $80 and $250 billion in Medicare fraud alone. So forget food stamp fraud, Social Security disability fraud, just in Medicare fraud between $80 and $250 billion. Can you imagine if Visa or MasterCard announced that they had between $80 to $250 billion of fraud? Hope it's not yours, Jeff, and I hope it's not yours, Stephen. It'd be totally unacceptable, and either of those companies would be taken out by a market competitor. But when you have a budget of trillions of dollars, it's somehow considered acceptable to, on the low end, allow $80 billion of Medicare fraud to continue. Well, the truth is, we've seen this in different areas, in different arenas of the federal government, particularly a few in the Pentagon that have adapted and have chosen, rather than to use government-created, government-sourced tools, they've actually gone to the private sector and asked for the algorithms to be developed. Basically, predictive analysis is now being used in the battlefield to show our servicemen and women on the ground where IEDs are going to be placed. The same stuff is being applied in certain circumstances at the IRS. The truth is, if the U.S. government had the guts, through the Congress, to task a group of technologists around the country to find savings through eradicating fraud, we ought to pay them a commission, and we ought to show the world what it looks like in a country of 320 or 330 million people to take care of business. And frankly, when you wipe out $200 billion of annual fraud, you take the first realistic step that our country's taken in 10 years back toward deficit reduction. And that can be done, but it's going to take guts, and it's going to have to take the government and bureaucrats being willing to admit that they don't do things as well as private companies do. Tax reform is a hot-button issue. The truth is, the reason that we go the direction that that I am advocating right here is because we need to talk in bold terms. This is the same case in a sense as what we're talking about with Social Security. The world has changed so much that the fact that our country has 70,000 pages of tax code is ridiculous, and I don't think it's reflective of the ingenuity of our country. It's unfortunate that even the most advanced, innovative people in our country still are bogged down once a year with a paper-laden process of paying taxes. I'm a believer that the purest form of taxation, even at a federal level, it's proven at a state level, is point-of-purchase consumption tax. It's actually philosophically, if we want to go to a philosophical level for a second, we shouldn't, especially in this country, tax people on what they earn. We should tax them on what they spend. We shouldn't penalize productivity. Every person at this table has been successful on some level, and it's because you're smart and you work hard and you push the envelope. And unfortunately, our country has historically decided to tax you based on how productive you are. And a lot of people call that the most popular form of consumption-based tax is called the fair tax. It is very responsible. It takes care of people that are low income, middle income, and upper income. It's simply fair in the sense that everybody would pay one. It's effectively, some people call it a national sales tax. Have you look at it. If you buy a $20,000 car, you're taxed on a $20,000 car. If you buy a $100,000 Ferrari, then you're going to be taxed, or a $300,000 Ferrari. Paul, you may know how much a Ferrari costs. I don't know exactly how much a Ferrari costs. And so the point being, that actually would be a real innovative, bold step for our country. Our country's not alone in facing a real quandary about how you update a tax code that was designed 100 years ago and has evolved into a total mess. I do think it's our role to show the world what it looks like to streamline this process to the point that businesses would not pay taxes. Individuals would not file any taxes under a fair tax. You simply would pay an additional federal tax on every item or service that you purchased, and the program is designed to be revenue neutral. We ought to talk about tax reform in an ambitious context. Even if we don't end up there, we ought to talk about it weighting things away from taxing productivity, in my opinion. Contract reform is particularly relevant because we've been talking about the VA administration, and a lot of people wonder how is it possible that the VA would lag so far behind even other departments within the federal government. A lot of the answer is that basically the data system there doesn't talk to the data system DOD. There's all these antiquated contractual processes that don't allow private sector companies to come in and fix government problems in a hurry. A great example of the need for contract reform, and really what we're talking about is getting rid of what is known as cost-plus contracting. You'd probably be scared at how often the federal government tells Randy Redberg, we need you to build a jet. We'll give you $20 million to build that jet, but if it costs more, we'll pay you that. And you come back and charge the government $60 million because that's how much it costs to build the jet. And our government widely lets that cost-plus process happen. That's basically what happened with the Obamacare exchanges. A great example I think this crowd will connect with, a lot of you know that Dr. Senator Tom Coburn from Oklahoma has been sort of a mentor of mine. He's one of the few people who's aggressive about actually reforming the federal government and advocating that we use innovative private sector practices to fix problems. He wrote in his book, and I've talked to him about an occasion when Elon Musk came and visited him in his office 3 years ago, and he knew that Tom Coburn was one of the few people who actually has tried to shore up the gap between private business and government. And he basically told him, SpaceX has figured out how to take a payload into outer space. SpaceX, for those people who are listening, I think everybody here knows, is Elon Musk's private space exploration company. 3 years ago, they'd gotten to a place where they could take a payload into outer space at a third the cost NASA could, and NASA began to use them. But DOD has almost a monopoly into sending things in outer space. And he came to Coburn saying, Boeing and Lockheed Martin had asked for a 5 to 7 year exclusive, which they were granted, where only the two of them could do anything related to space in this country. That is so un-American. It runs so counter to the rules of markets, and productivity, and competition. And I think it's a great example for the need for transparency in the contracting process. We ought to give people like Elon Musk or anybody at this table the opportunity to innovate, and the government be willing to listen to those innovations from the private sector. Next, this one connects to this company because as you travel this district, it's interesting and ironic that Chattanooga is now the gig city, and I work in a technology incubator in a building that used to be an old department store, yet there are a couple counties and portions of other counties in this district where people are still on dial-up internet. And so the horizons that they see in their lives, particularly for young people, are just different than what people would grow up with in Chattanooga or one of our surrounding counties. This district, a lot of people don't know, actually touches Kentucky in two different places. Two different of our counties are on the Kentucky border. Morgan County, which is south of those, is notorious for having just gotten running water in some places in the last decade, and rural broadband is still a real struggle there. In order for not just rural counties in East Tennessee, but I want to represent Tennessee's 3rd district, and so I'm looking out for these counties. In order for young people, particularly in these counties, to have an opportunity to compete, they need broadband, and I believe that's on the way. But secondly, they need their eyes open to technology, because one of the beauties, I think, of educating yourself to program, learning how to code, is that in the future it can be done from anywhere. And the question I get asked all the time, whether I'm in Monroe County or Campbell County or Scott County, is what do we do to keep our young people here? Because we're bleeding out our talent. Nobody wants to stay in Oneida. Nobody wants to stay in Wartburg. Nobody wants to stay in Madisonville, Tennessee. And there are exceptions, but the truth is young people are seeing more and more of the opportunities in larger markets. That trend can be reversed through technology as young people like Josh Marlowe, who's one of Travis's team members and frankly, a real prominent member of the developer community in Chattanooga, who went to Campbell County High School, really beat the odds in a sense, and ended up pursuing a computer science undergraduate and graduate degree at UT, and now works for one of the most prominent startups in Chattanooga. What we ought to do, I've always, and many of you know this, I've never been a believer in the Federal Department of Education. They've struggled for 50 years to ever show any decidedly positive progress. And it should be downsized dramatically. And the decisions through block grants ought to come at a state level. And I think some of the block grants ought to be to the 50 states to go and innovate best practices for how to introduce in K-12 and then at technology centers and two-year colleges programming degrees. And we ought to begin opening even elementary school students in rural counties to programming, because the truth is, if you want to know the best way that the United States of America can position ourselves to have a world-class workforce, it would be to do that. And it would also at the same time give life and vitality to rural communities that are losing people otherwise, where the truth is Josh Marlowe in the future, if he had chosen to, could continue to live and work in La Follette and enjoy that quality of life if that's his decision. Unfortunately, fewer people are being able to make that decision to remain in smaller communities because jobs aren't there. Next, this one's close to my heart. It's I live in Lookout Valley, which is a rural community, at least a suburb of Chattanooga. Parts of it certainly feel rural, and they feel in some cases like a lot of the other districts that we travel between. Tennessee's 3rd district is without question the methamphetamine capital of the world. Tennessee's probably the worst meth state in the United States of America. 40% of the meth production in this state comes from the 3rd district. In the last report, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd worst meth counties by number of meth seizures were all 3 counties, Anderson, Roane, and Monroe in this district. There are a few counties that are also competing with it. It has a tragic effect on people's lives. It frankly is not like other drugs in that it grabs you by the teeth and doesn't let go. And when you go into small communities and you talk to people who've lived there for 50 or 60 years, there's a sadness in each of them because they know of the impact that prescription drugs and meth has in their communities. There is no way that as a United States congressman, the state representatives, the county mayors can effectively advocate for economic development, for manufacturing opportunities, for outside investment in rural East Tennessee counties if 5–10% of the workforce is on the sidelines because they're screwed up on drugs. Some people would say that's not the job of a United States congressman. I would say nobody's doing the job, and if I'm elected, I'll do the job. In 1999, my dad helped start and fund the Tennessee Meth Task Force, which for a long time pushed back on this issue in an innovative way. It really set a best practice standard across the country for what a private partnership, what a government partnership with local law enforcement could look like. A lot of the people that drove the trucks, they were on a shoestring budget. People that would drive the Tennessee Meth Task Force cleanup trucks were retired officers who volunteered their time. Now that's lost its meager federal funding. It certainly doesn't have an advocate in the Congress. And I'm just telling you, and Chattanooga is in no ways an exception to the damage that meth is wreaking still for 15 years. A lot of people don't know meth is not everywhere. In fact, meth has been largely defeated in some countries. I mean, in some counties and in some states in our country. And it's important to understand why. I am all for private citizens being protected from government interference as much as possible. I'm also all for the government doing what it needs to do to protect law-abiding citizens from drugs and the actions and illegal activity. Most theft in this district is driven by people stealing money or stealing drugs. And that's why this is an important issue. In the counties where they've actually, at a local level, enacted laws to make pseudoephedrine harder to get a hold of, all that happens there is now pills become more popular, and there's these pill farms in Florida. And you'll send 10 people down in a van, they'll all get their maximum prescription, they'll drive back to Campbell County, and all of a sudden it's back on the black market. There's a reason for interstate commerce laws. And the federal government needs to lock down the way the pseudoephedrine moves around, at least even if it's in the southeast where meth is prominent. And I'll be a leader on that issue, because the truth is you can't be a leader on other issues unless we're willing to deal with meth. And I've never heard our congressman talk about meth, at least in a substantive way. Last point we'll talk about before I want to kind of ask for some input from you guys are a couple congressional reform issues. And some of this is stuff I've been talking about for 2.5 or 3 years, and some of it I think is the insight gained from having grown up around this process. The first is a modernizing or an elimination of congressional pensions. A lot of people, frankly, there's a lot of misinformation about how congressional pensions work. They're probably not as, they're no different than most federal pensions. Some people think members of Congress get paid their entire salary their whole life, and that's not true. But what is important, and what is, I think, most important for people who have a concern that members of Congress stay in office too long. If I hear about one issue more than any other, it's term limits, and it's people's feelings across East Tennessee that people stay in Congress too long. So I think the most realistic response to that may not be amending the Constitution to enact arbitrary term limits, because that's difficult. I like the idea of stepping up and running against an ineffective incumbent as being the purest form of term limits. But if we're going to try, some of you guys didn't catch the joke, that's what we're doing here. We're in the process. I think it's important to look at what are the incentives in place. That there are incentives, a lot of people don't know this, that cause members of Congress to plan out their careers to be there longer. The congressional pension plan actually sweetens over time. 20 years is for a while in the modern congressional pension era been kind of the magic year. And so what I propose is either that you flatten it and from day one you have X pension, or I just like the idea of using the pension because it can be just through basic legislation. It can be changed and enacted projectively, where the people who are in Congress now don't have to vote away their own pension. They probably won't do that. I'll vote either to cut mine or to change the terms where there's no incentive to stay longer. I even like the idea of letting the pension remain until 10 years. If you want to stay in Congress beyond 10 years, your pension begins to roll back. It's actually much more realistic to affect the decision making, the career decisions of members of Congress based on pension and even committee assignments than it ever would be probably to enact term limits. And so I think that's just an important first step. It may be an important first step to term limits. I've said in the future it may come to a time where politicians are so out of touch that term limits are an appropriate conversation. And then the other, and everybody at this table has heard me at some point talk about gerrymandering. Everybody hears about gerrymandering in 5th grade civics class. Tennessee's 3rd district it's probably an unfortunate example of gerrymandering. The idea of a congressional district, as best as I understand it, is that a group of people with similar interests geographically would be represented by the same person in Congress. And so when you go back to the beginning of our country, when they drew the first congressional maps, they all looked like globs of counties. Or if it was a more populated area, it would be portions of the same community. Now, state legislatures, because state legislatures have full control over how the lines are redrawn every 10 years after the censuses, they just run roughshod over what actually should be the design of the districts in order to serve people well, in order to achieve a political outcome. And that's the reason that Cleveland is not in this district, but Oneida, 150 miles from here is because the state legislature was trying to get cute and win as many Republican seats as possible. I'm a Republican, but I don't think that's a good practice for the country. In fact, there have been a few states, rarely, in my opinion, does good politics and best practices in government come from California. But California is one of the states that's actually, their state legislature changed the laws to put in place a bipartisan commission where Republicans and Democrats would come together every 10 years to redraw the lines in an appropriate way that would serve the people well. Also, what comes out of that process is you don't have Republican-dominated districts and Democratic-dominated districts, but you have districts that are competitive across party lines so that our country can have a healthy conversation about two competing political philosophies that, frankly, over time have served our country very well. Only 5 to 10% of congressional districts in this cycle are competitive across party lines. Almost every congressional district in the country is only competitive in primaries, and the principal driver behind that is gerrymandering. I think this is one of the few areas where I do think there needs to be a federal solution. I think the federal government still should leave it up to states to appoint that commission, but I think every state ought to have an independent commission, not state legislatures that are trying to rig the system. And an example would be this state having 7 Republicans and 2 Democrats, while just 6 years ago we had actually 5 Democrats and 4 Republicans. Most of that, and the reason it's likely to remain that way for several years, is driven by the gerrymandering process. So that's it. Those are the 8 main areas we want to focus. Obviously, all this is my intentions for the battles that I want to pick when I get to Congress. I've been around the process, and I grew up around it enough to know that no member of Congress can be effective and try to do everything. So obviously there are a whole slew of different issues that weren't addressed here that I'll have the opportunity to weigh in on and eventually at different times maybe lead on. These are all close to my heart. They're all things that I think I'm positioned well as a young, aggressive, heat-seeking missile in the Congress. I think I can make a big difference. I hope to connect what is in our community sort of known as the entrepreneurship community to what's going on in Washington and do that at a greater level. I hope that you all will help me do that. I think it's so important for our country. It's one of the reasons that I've always advocated for more young people being a part of the process, because thinking in Washington so often becomes antiquated. And I think particularly in the changing times of technology that we're living through right now, when the average age in the Congress is 63 years old, it's no wonder that we're not looking for the right places for solutions, and the expectations of efficiency aren't where they ought to be, because so many people there don't come from a background that would be knowledgeable about the capabilities of technology. So with that said, what I want to ask y'all for, anybody who wants to give input onto what I talked about, feel free to. What I'm even more interested in are from your different areas of expertise, your own ideas about innovative practices that ought to be pushed into government and at least introduced to government.
Well, I think one that makes a lot of sense to me is the tax reform and kind of the way you're approaching it. You know, it's obviously a pretty radical approach, just a flat sales tax. I mean, that's, you know, we talk about things like that.
Sure.
The practicality of it ever existing, maybe not there, but why not pick the fight and start the conversation?
Right.
You know, that's in the business world. A lot of times you maybe start with a crazy idea of how it could be, and then you figure out how to get there, right. And maybe, you know, flying cars or electric cars or, oh wait, we have that one, right? It's just a matter of throw a lofty goal out there and then work backwards and figure out, okay, step 1 would be this, step 2 would be this. So I like that you're kind of throwing deep on some of these, especially the tax reform. Yeah. You know, because, yeah, are we going to have a flat tax in 2 years? No. But could you spend 10 years talking about it and move the needle and get us to a better place? Yeah.
Well, drive the conversation to a place where we actually consider ideas rather than just what we've done is kind of just made small adjustments to the same broken system for 100 years, more or less.
Yeah.
And every once in a while we'll reform it and then we'll start tinkering again.
Okay, so coming from the education background, I'm really happy to hear you talk a little bit about coding and programming and all of that being an important component, because 77% of all jobs in the United States require some computer skills. And yet, most high schools do not offer any coding classes and things like that. We are also lagging behind in women in STEM careers, science, technology, engineering, and math. And we're not doing enough early on to really introduce our kids to what these careers are. Now, we need to do the coding piece, but we also need to also integrate what are the career paths that students can take in order to be successful in good careers. We're just pushing people into college, and we really don't even care what they major in. And so next time you go in a restaurant, ask your waiter what degree they have, because we're graduating so many kids that can't get jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's not a practical aspect of what the colleges are doing.
That's right.
You know, in fact, I have a lot of programmers that work with me, and I'd say that probably 80% of them are self-taught.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so they have the desire to go do something, and all you have to do is give them a challenge, you know, a project or something like that. I have one guy that went away for a weekend and learned PHP, you know, and it's just unbelievable, you know, what you can do with that kind of stuff. But even if you do introduce it, you got to be current. Like I do have a BSEE degree with computer science, but you know what I learned? I learned COBOL, and I learned Wi-Fi, and I learned punch cards, and I mean there was zero applicability coming out of college.
Sure.
And so you got to make sure that the things that are taught are current. You know, and even in today's community colleges, they're still pretty far behind on their syllabuses and stuff. So, you know, it's actually I came out of a co-op school. I came out of the University of Cincinnati. That was the most valuable thing I ever did. I think there needs to be a stronger integration into industry at different levels, even if it's internships or whatever, so that people can practically apply what they're learning and then give them some insight what the current things are that are needed out there.
I think what's so cool about it is that it keeps people in our community. I mean, I know a good friend of mine who works for a West Coast startup, but loves the quality of life of Tennessee. Wouldn't leave Dixon if it's, you know, somebody held a gun to his head. He's able to make a really great living and provide for his family and stay exactly where he wants. And he can work remotely. He works for, and he's flown out there every so often to circle up and see how things are going. But then he can come right back and be a dynamic member of our community. So I feel like that's a huge advantage.
That's a real challenge. I could take it. The amazing thing about our gerrymandered congressional district is that it is gerrymandered to its absolute prettiest point. Tennessee's 3rd district has been gerrymandered over and over and over again. It's never been prettier than it is now, because Scott County and Campbell County are, I mean, a couple of times Marshall and I were up there this past weekend, and you stop and I think he said something to the effect of, this is unbelievable. It's really like Chattanooga. In Campbell County, Chattanooga's beauty is almost multiplied because there's just more of it. Where we have a few mountain systems and rivers, they've got massive expanses of Norris Lake and literally a mountain range that runs almost the entire length of the county. The point being, you can see why people would want to stay. And the quality of life there can be incredible if you have a job, which good jobs are far, they're really tough to come by, or you're traveling an hour into Knoxville or Chattanooga for good work.
I just think this is really a surprising and fascinating, in a good way, statement of some very lofty goals, because it seems to me that getting elected in Congress nowadays has been reduced to patriotic political platitudes that mean little and don't take risk, and yet you're taking a risk with things that can attract controversy and can attract opposition, but yet you're stepping out to say something that's really unique and different. I'm just fascinated to think that the 3rd district is now mature enough to actually be a leader in these types of things. And do you think that our district is really ready to step forward and say, we want to take national leadership on these issues and do something truly different?
I think Chattanooga is certainly in a position to do that.
Yep.
I think y'all know that's part of what draws me to this process, is a belief that it actually can be better, a belief that if certain people, and I hope to be one of the first, set a different standard that's not motivated by espousing a party ideal or an ideological concept, but by pragmatism and fixing the country and leaving this place better than we found it. If a few people do that, then more people can do it. And the next thing you know, government's never going to be brilliant and efficient and as sharply run as Travis's startup. But it can certainly be a lot better than it is now. And I think the way the context of the discussion should be in the next 10 years is closer to this than where it is in Washington right now. Because most of the time, it's just finger pointing. That's normally the name of the game in Washington, is surviving based on making the other guy look worse than you. And y'all just know that's not really in my spirit. So people in the district know, and they should know in the next few months, if that's what they want out of their congressman, then I'm not going to be their guy. If they want somebody who's going to be blindly loyal to a party, I'm not your guy. But if you want somebody who's going to go and talk about things in an ambitious way and try to push and prod the process and the conversation, hopefully to a higher minded place, that's me. And I don't have all the answers, but I tend to have friends who know all the answers. That's the way I think about it.
You know, Weston, you brought in a bunch of technology people here, so I guess you're going to get a lot of technology stuff. But you know, our society, and especially our young people, are growing up in a society on the internet where it's very popular to be disruptive, right? And I'm sure everybody's familiar. You know, be disruptive. How do you do things just different? And I think that's one thing. Government is not. They're not, you know, prone to being disruptive. They don't like that, you know. But I think as people grow up and become older, I think that's going to be a key issue. It's, you know, why are we doing it this way? We've always done it this way. Why? Let's do it different. And that's the internet's given them that ability to be disruptive, you know, and to touch, I mean, people from not only around the country but all over the world, you know, and really have that interaction with. I know we do. Our company, little company, people. I look at our logs from the Gaza Strip every day, you know.
That's really wild.
I mean, you know, so.
I think you're right. Some of you probably heard me say that I think the plague of Washington today is risk aversion more than anything else. And it's that the political process and the powers that be try to create that type of environment. And I think our congressman has fallen victim to it. And it's this idea that if you safeguard yourself from ever doing anything bold or ever talking about anything controversial, that's the safest path to re-election. The problem is you got 535 people following that safest path. And it doesn't serve our country well. And I don't think in the future that I just don't get the feeling anymore that it's what people want. I think the people have begun to figure that out. They just haven't had a lot of candidates who are willing to break the traditional party molds and not just speak in the partisan platitudes, but go talk about things that matter. If I'm wrong about a few of these things, great. Hopefully there will be other competitive minds that come and bring better, sharper ideas out of the things I propose, but I at least want to push the debate to a place it hasn't been.
That is refreshing. I think you can be disruptive in all the good ways. And so many of the things that have been brought up here seem so much obvious to us. We're paying attention. A little bit like a startup that has to adapt. Look at the Congress that you'll be joining. It's a little bit like IBM or like Gazprom or something.
Yeah.
It's going to be a challenge. I appreciate you kind of being the tip of the spear on this, and I hope you can gather allies along the way because this can be a very powerful change.
Yeah. Well, you know, as I've talked about a lot, one of the realistic goals I have in my first year in Congress is to begin the process of hopefully inspiring other people of different professional backgrounds to come run for Congress. The Congress would be well served if people like Tiffany Robinson ran for Congress. Too often the process and the party bosses and the influencers and politics go and choose risk-averse people who are going to walk the party line and not challenge the status quo and not talk about things in a substantive, high-minded way. But I do think once the glass is broken, so to speak, that there's an opportunity to go and recruit more people who want to actually try to fix our massive government. Because it can be done. If it could be done anywhere, I have confidence it could be done here. So I'm going to keep saying that.
One of the things you point out here, I think that makes total sense, is there are a lot of private sector ideas that apply to governmental problems, can solve things. I think the next step on that is how do you and how does Congress and the government make it so that private sector people can get that work done in a sort of non-profiteering sort of way? Because a lot of times people look at government contracts as that cost plus stuff. Oh baby, this is a way to make some money, as opposed to I think if that could be contract reform, whatever, if you could make it better, there are a lot of high-minded, well-intentioned people that would, look at Code for America and all that stuff, that would give a year or two, maybe not the commitment that you're going to make to Congress of, years and years, but a year or two to solve a problem. Yeah. And young people would love to. It's a great. All those programs work pretty well when done right. But how do you pull the private sector into solving these problems and then let them go home once they're solved? I think that'll be key on some of these things you're looking at here.
Sure. Well, I think it'd be a great standard to set. I think even if you just started with one department and you pulled in a group of technologists to attack the problem and you paid them a commission on savings, you talk about worldwide headlines, it made a lot of sense. Where, you send them home. You send them home with a pot of
well-earned spoils.
Shoot, yeah. I think that would say a lot about our country's willingness to fix our biggest problems. because there's no doubt that the government struggles to reform itself, and there are ample opportunities to pull private sector minds in to address some of government's problems, save a lot of money for taxpayers in the process, and also give incentive to technologists across the country to want to participate.
I think you convened a group of people who, at some point in their career, have had to put all our cards on the table in an uncertain situation and believe in whatever it is that we're doing. And I'd like to say thanks to you for doing the same thing, at least expressing that's what your intention is to do by saying, you know what, I'm going to go after things that are controversial. I'm going to go after things that are guaranteeing me a career. And the thing that I know is at the end of the day, the only thing we all have, our job, people ask me all the time, what's your job? My job is to do whatever it takes to keep my business going, period. That's what I do every single day. And what I'm asking of you is that you follow through with this and you do whatever it takes. Because I believe if anybody can, that a millennial congressman can do it. And we've got your back. And I think the thing that matters is that you pull the right people into that conversation all the time. I'm willing to help you at any time, and I think there's a lot of people around this table who are. So thank you for standing up and taking the chance and putting your neck out there on the line for us.
Thanks. Well, it's the standard you guys set, no kidding, and the people that are closest to me know this. I mean, it's a standard that I've said this so many times as a candidate. I'm really not motivated to run for Congress because I grew up around Congress or because my dad is Zach Wamp. I'm motivated to run for Congress because in being a part of getting lampposts off the ground, I realized that on this side of government, people talk about changing things and then they go try. And a lot of times they change things. But the action is real, and there's a commitment to excellence in the private sector that I never was familiar with around government, unfortunately. It's just a different standard, I think, that could be attributed to a bunch of other things. Thank you guys for being here. I want to honor your time, and so I told you I'd have you out here by 3. If the media has a question, I'll let you fire away for a couple minutes, and I can still get them out here in time.
We can just get you when you're done.
Okay.
I think that's for us.
Yes. Same? All right. Good. Y'all have anything else?
Thank
you. Thank you. Thanks. I know it's just a busy beginning of the week. A few busy guys. Other than this,
Because he hasn't slept.